the Homestead Studios in Santa Clarita, California, it's the start of Season 3 of Just the Tip-Sters with Melissa Morgan.
I'm Kaiser Soze.
If you've got a tip for Melissa, the who, the what, the why, how to stop asking so many goddamn questions, anything, tell us about it by calling the Tipster hotline at 832-TIPSTER. That's 832-847-7837, or send an email to jttipsters@gmail.com. You just might hear your tip on the podcast. And now here's your host, opening the door to a brand new year and not letting it in until it's been scanned for viruses, Melissa Morgan.
More. Cowbell.
Yeah, that's a lot of cowbell.
I'm exploring the space.
Exploring the space.
That's what Bruce Dickinson said to do in The Bruce Dickinson.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got a new cowbell, in case anyone's horrified right now. I got a new cowbell. I'm in love with it. I took the clanger out. According to producer Mark, that was the best thing to do. And I'm now hitting it with my ripstick from Pound Class. They're like a plasticky weighted drumstick that I take a class in. Love it.
Okay.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
It's, beginning of season 3. That's just crazy shit right there.
I can't either.
Yeah, can't even.
Episode 117.
Wowsies. Wow.
Unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. And we wouldn't be here if it weren't for you beautiful tipsters. And I want to thank our newest patron, Tipster Maggie, who is an exceptional human being. And we are very grateful for her and all of the patrons. We are working on this year being able to offer you early access to the episodes a day earlier if you're a patron. So you would get them on Monday as opposed to Tuesday.
That's what we're going to work on.
We're working on it. Producer Mark is still getting the bugs out, but that's something we'd like to offer to those of you who are already patrons. And you can become a patron and get the early access along with some sweet swag that I ended up taking a couple of bags of swag to our wonderful automotive experts here in the Santa Clarita Valley, R&S Automotive, who is a family-run business, the only auto shop that AAA recommends. They are not in the business of recommending any auto shops, but AAA will recommend them, and they give them, all of their diamond ratings or whatever. And they're great people.
They are. They really are.
Honest as the day is long. My story with them is I've had probably 3 cars since we've lived here and gone to them. But the first one I had was a Mazda Tribute, and my air conditioning stopped working. And it was 1,000 degrees, and I was furious and took it there. And a couple hours later, they called and said, "Hey, all those Starbucks napkins you collect and put in your glove box?" I'm like, "Yeah." They're like, "Stop it." So I consider this a design flaw with Mazda. The glove box did not stop. It had an opening in the back, and all of my Starbucks napkins had gone behind the glove box and blocked all the vents.
I think that's great.
So they had taken out all of those napkins, and I came to pick my car up. I'm like, "How much do I owe you?" And they're like, "Nothing."
See, there you go.
Labor? Time? Nothing? No, nothing. Just don't put a bunch of napkins in your glove box anymore, dummy. So since then, I really haven't had a problem, although I do now keep them in the console of any car I own. But they're the best. But I used to have a license plate that said Relax Yoga, RLXYOGA, for 15 years. And this year, I changed it to TRUCRM. And I was thrilled to death to get that because it's pretty difficult here in California. And the owner, Eddie, was talking to the guy who was processing after I just got my oil changed. And he said, "Yeah, make sure you put the correct license plate on. Everybody loves those old school license plates now, and everybody's changing them up." And another guy came up and said, "What, is that true crime? Is that what that means?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, "I love true crime. Oh my God." And I was like, "Oh, here's one of my, cards to listen to the podcast." And then 3 other men came running up and, I love true crime too. Can I have a card? And I'm like, well, yeah. And they're like, what? So tell me about it. So I was just telling them a little bit about it and what had, spurred me on to do this, which was, Will Sarazan going missing. And they were like, oh yeah, I remember when that happened. And then they all started telling me all of their true crime stories. They couldn't wait to tell me. And I'm like, hey, on this card I gave you, there's an email address. Fucking email me. I am not standing here talking to you about a bunch of dead people. I'm tired and I want to go home. So hopefully they're going to email me, but they're...
Oh, I bet they will. I'm sure they will.
And if you would like to email us, it's jttipsters@gmail.com. And again, there's no us without you. So we would love for you to give us any ideas that you would like us to cover, much like the one that we're going to do this episode was suggested by Tipster Ryan, who has a passion for cases where he feels that someone may be wrongly accused or maybe even wrongly convicted. He's an interesting fellow, Ryan. So we're going to talk about that. It's a really fascinating, deep, layered case. But if you would like to stop by Apple Podcasts and rate us with 5 stars, write a review if you would like. We would love that too. And subscribe to this podcast. We would be very grateful. And if you don't like going online, you can always call us at 832-847-7837. And that's our number here. So you can leave us any sort of tip you might have. It's a beautiful thing, and we are really grateful for you, the listeners. So not only are we grateful for our patrons and our listeners, we are grateful for those of you who email us with suggestions for how to stop my nosebleeds. I am grateful to Tipster Penny again, who not only recommended vitamin K, which I've been taking for a couple of weeks, and humidifiers. And I actually don't think it's my allergies anymore, Penny. I think it's what the ENT said is probably my deviated septum. And the nosebleeds continue, and they're so much fun. But, I have a new protocol.
They're not really fun.
They're not fun. They're terrible. I have a wonderful new protocol because of my BFF, Angela, who sent me all these wonderful rolls of cotton that dentists use, and I just put some Afrin on one. It's not as nearly as awful as having a big tampon hanging out your nose. You put a little Afrin on it and shove it up your nostrils. I actually cut them in half. Apparently I have a much smaller nose than I thought, because even the full-size dental rolls stuck out a little bit, but they're much, more low profile than a tampon, and they're really great. They really help. But it's been, knock wood, it's been 48 hours since my last nosebleed. I feel like I'm at a AA meeting. It's been 48 hours since my last nosebleed.
We got your 48-hour chip here.
Right.
And...
Is it red?
Yes.
Because it's all bloody.
Red, yes.
Yes, but it's been 48 hours since my last nosebleed, and I am grateful for that. I just keep hoping that keeps going on, but I am going back to the ENT next week, and we'll see what's going on. And hopefully it's not a big deal. Okay, all right. This case that was submitted by Tipster Ryan is so large. I have been working on it since Tipster Ryan gave me the information, and it is such a huge rabbit hole. It's a labyrinth. It's a mess, and it's been going on for a long time. And while I have no proof that Joe D. Bryan is innocent, I tend to lean toward that, as I think most people who would read what happened to him. And I know Tipster Ryan is passionate about this case and thinks that Mr. Bryan can use all of the help he can get at this point in his life, and I think he's right. Mr. Bryan has been in prison for 35 years for the murder of his wife, and he is 78 years old and has congestive heart failure, and he is still hanging on with all the faith that he has. It was a huge case in Texas in 1985, and I found many newspaper clippings, the Longview News Journal, the Tyler Courier Times, but honestly, the two journalists who have spent the most time, and I mean incredible amounts of time, research, dedication, and getting personally involved, is the editor of the Clifton Record, Leon Smith, and a wonderful senior reporter at ProPublica. Her name is Pamela Koloff. She's also a writer at large for the New York Times. And she had a 2-part series on Joe Bryan's case. And it was a really unique partnership between the New York Times Magazine and ProPublica. And they each allowed her to report on, criminal justice stories and use the resources of both publications. This case is unique in many, many ways, and it's still ongoing. Joe's last appeal was denied in November of 2018, I think. So Joe and Mickey Bryan lived in Clifton, Texas, which is a lovely small town of about 3,000 people. It's 100 miles southwest of Dallas. And Mickey Blue, that was her maiden name, was this quiet high school girl, but she was actually voted Miss Clifton High School pretty much against her will. Her friends had nominated her, and she didn't like any sort of attention. And unlike a lot of, Texas girls of the time, she didn't have big hair, and she didn't wear a lot of makeup. She was really naturally beautiful. She had these gorgeous, teeth that just shone like diamonds. Her smile was spectacular. And as quiet and shy as Mickey was, Joe Bryan was just the opposite. He was this outgoing guy who had kind blue eyes that sort of put everyone at ease. And they got together, and even though they were so opposite, they really fell in love. And they got married in a small private ceremony in 1969. And Mickey, unlike a lot of brides, she didn't want like a big public church wedding. So they got married at the home of Joe's pastor. Just a small wedding. And it's just the two of them. Mickey couldn't have kids, but they both loved kids and they loved education, but not just regular teaching jobs. These are the people that became involved in their students' lives. It would be more difficult to do nowadays, but in the 70s and 80s, they were rock stars of a small community because of their kindness. So Mickey ends up teaching 4th grade in the elementary school, and Joe is offered the job in 1975 as the principal of Clifton High, where Mickey had graduated. So they settled into a really lovely ranch house in Clifton and just loved their lives. They enjoyed their lives. They loved being together more than anything. They spent part of their summer vacation away from teaching, coming up with lesson plans for Mickey's 4th grade classes and some different strategies on how to deal with students who were, reluctant learners, who were kind of difficult to reach. They just loved, they both had this theory that the power of education is transformative. And I just love that. It's a beautiful thing. So their neighbors said that pretty much every night the weather was amenable. They would take walks after dinner around the neighborhood and they would hold hands. And it wasn't a walk to see what was going on. It was a walk where they were talking and completely engrossed in each other. It just like they didn't know there wasn't a world around them. It was just the two of them talking and walking and holding hands like a team, just living their lives together. Somebody described something like this to me once, and at first it made me prickly. And then I thought, it's such a great description. I'm going to use it here. They called a relationship between two people a nation of two. And I love that.
Oh, I like that.
I love that phrase. And, I'm a firm believer. It's taken me a long time after trying not to be a nosy busybody in some girlfriends' relationships where my opinion really doesn't matter. No matter if they ask you, your opinion doesn't matter. Because I guarantee you, if you give them your opinion when they're broken up, they'll get back together and then you'll be the asshole. So I don't tell anyone anymore if I don't like their choice of partner, because it's really none of my business. Even if they try to make it my business, it just isn't. I'm a firm believer no one on the outside of a relationship can know what goes on in a relationship between two people. And I don't mean it doesn't have to be two lovers or two, spouses. It can be siblings or a mother and child or two friends. It's just, you don't know what goes on between two people. So I try to butt out, but apparently not everyone knows how to do that. So on Tuesday, October 15th of 1985, very early in the morning at the elementary school where Mickey taught, her friend Susan Klein walked by her door, Mickey's door, and noticed that it was locked and the lights were not turned on, which was very unusual because Mickey was always the first one there before everyone else, preparing the room for the kids. So Susan kind of went about the morning, and now it's like 8 o'clock in the morning, and she's like, oh, this is not right. So she stops by the principal's office. His name is Rex Daniels. And she said, did you forget to call in a sub for Mickey? Is she sick today? And he knows something is wrong immediately. So he drives to Mickey's house, and knowing that her husband, Joe, is out of town, the garage doors were up, and her car was still in the garage. He called Mickey's parents because he had their number as next of kin if Joe wasn't around, because Joe was at this educators convention 120 miles away in Austin. It was a yearly convention for secondary educators as well as principals. So Mickey's parents, Vera and Otis Blue, show up right away. They have a key to get in. The principal, Rex Daniels, just waited because he didn't want to try and get in. And that was smart.
That's very smart.
Very smart. But Vera and Otis are the first to find their daughter as they walk through the house yelling her name. And Vera lets out a scream as soon as she opens the master bedroom. There was blood really described as pretty much everywhere, which you think that's bullshit, except when you see the pictures. And it is everywhere. There's a large amount of blood on the bed, all soaked through into the mattress. There's blood on all four walls. There's blood on the ceiling.
Oh my God. Mickey
is face down on the bed, and her legs are dangling off to the side. And she had been shot 4 times, 3 in the head and once in the abdomen. So at about 10 a.m., about an hour and a half after this, on October 15th, at the Texas Association of Secondary School Principals Conference in Austin, Joe Bryan is taken aside by the executive director, and he had to tell Joe that his wife was dead. So Joe pretty much became numb and lost it, as one would expect. I mean, everyone has a different reaction, but he is consoled by many of the people that he knows at the conference. One of them is a man named Glenn Nix. He's an assistant school principal, and he took Joe's keys. And another principal drove Joe home, the 120 miles home, with Glenn following, driving Joe's black Mercury, and Joe was being driven back by Harold Massey. And they get to the house about 3 hours later. The police were obviously still processing the house. Joe is just, dazed, and he tries to answer as many questions as he can. Now, here's kind of an odd thing about a gun. Obviously, they asked Joe if you have any firearms in the house. And he said, I have a .357 pistol in the bedroom that I keep loaded with birdshot to get rid of snakes that are in the yard. So in all of my research, which let me tell you, kids, it's a lot. A case this old with so much history and so much around it, different publications list different things. So I have heard that it was a .357 loaded with birdshot. I have heard it's a .38 listed or loaded with rat shot. I don't know if there's a difference between birdshot and rat shot and buckshot, maybe. I'm not adept at firearms and ammo, but it's... Go ahead, sorry.
No, that's baffling to me because I didn't know that pistols shoot bullets.
That's what I thought.
Okay, and shotguns shoot with cartridges that contain shot, either buckshot or birdshot or rat shot or whatever. The standard buckshot is the full force pellets that come out of the the cartridge. Birdshot and the lighter stuff comes out at a much it's kind of a glorified BB gun type of thing. It's not very powerful. But I didn't know that they made it for pistols.
I don't know. All I know is that it was he listed it as to the police as a .357 pistol loaded with birdshot. So the Texas Rangers are called in with this case because there'd been a lot going on in the small town of Clifton in the last 4 months. We're talking about a town of 3,000 people. We're pretty much sure everyone would know everyone's name or close to everyone's name, especially if you lived there a while and put down roots. So they call in the Texas Rangers, and the Texas Rangers call in a man named Robert Thorman. Now, he's a detective with Harker Heights PD, which is in a neighboring county in Bell County. But he is the, local blood stain analysis expert. And he takes strings that he tacks to the wall and tries to trace the blood stains and the blood-soaked mattress and all the stains on the headboards. And the only conclusion he could come to with all of his examination is that the killer was standing on the west side of the bed when the gun was fired. So I do not want to put down any sort of analyst or expert, but this is going to come into play later, and it has remarkably horrible shades of the Michael Peterson case, and I still don't know if Michael Peterson is guilty or not. I would say probably, but it's difficult to say. But I'm going to say Joe Bryan is, for the most part, I'm going to say he's not guilty. And he got the same or worse horrible analysis that Michael Peterson did. If you saw the staircase and saw the quote-unquote blood spatter expert who took a weekend workshop, by the way, 1 weekend workshop, drop a styrofoam head from the top of a ladder into a Dixie Chinette plate of red fake blood and call it a test, this is almost as bad. Mr. Thorman had a 1-week course, a 40-hour course, which, by the way, this is how deep undercover Pamela Koloff, the author, went. She took the same course. She managed to get into a blood spatter 40-hour course and came away with nothing, except that it's pretty difficult to come up with a correct analysis of a blood stain. You can try, you can, say gravity causes this and different shots cause this, but I really don't want to say, now they're saying fingerprint analysis is not, bite analysis has been really roundly beaten to death and say that that's not a science, calling it junk science. I don't want to say blood spatter is a junk science, but I'm telling you, it takes somebody with more than a weekend or a 40-hour course to be able to describe what happened in a murder.
That's right.
It's really...
That's the point, is that I don't think any of it is junk science, but you have to be a real scientist,
right,
to be considered an expert. And it's amazing to me that the courts allow someone with with really no experience at all to be classified as an expert in a criminal trial.
Exactly.
Where somebody's life is on the line.
Exactly. So with the Rangers in charge of this investigation now, there is a man who's helming it, and his name is Joe Willie. He is a longtime Texas Ranger. And he says, I need to talk to Joe Bryan. And he tracks him down at the funeral home where they're preparing for Mickey's burial. And Joe Bryan goes with Joe Willie to the station, and he doesn't take an attorney. He is not thinking there's a problem. He just wants to focus on, his wife not being with him anymore and finding out who could have done this. And Joe Bryan said, no, there was nothing out of the ordinary on Monday the 14th when I talked to Mickey on the phone. We got on the phone about 9 and hung up about 9:15. I called her from the hotel. I was watching the Country Music Awards on TV. She was grading papers, and she was in great spirits. And we hung up and I went to bed and went to the conference in the morning, and then someone came and told me my wife was murdered. And Joe Willie knows he's in trouble. He has 2 murders now. 2 murders on his hands in the small town of Clifton, Texas. Because 4 months earlier, Judy Whitley, who's a 17-year-old girl who walked to the store to get a soft drink, was found nude in a pasture near a grove of cedar trees on the west side of town. 17-year-old girl. She had ligature marks on her wrists and duct tape over her mouth. She had been sexually assaulted, and her manner of death was listed as strangulation. Now, one of the worst headlines I read in one of the local papers about this case was Judy Whitley's death being investigated as a homicide. Yeah.
Yeah, you think?
Yeah. She could tie her own hands and put duct tape over her mouth. Could she sexually assault herself and strangle herself manually without passing out? I mean, That's
just bad newspapering.
Yes.
That's just bad.
Yes, it was. So it's 4 months earlier and 1 mile away from Mickey and Joe Bryan's house. And the Texas Rangers interviewed, in both cases, the same people. Gardeners who were in the area. There was a road crew who was working about a block away from Mickey's house. They used helicopters to fly over fields looking for clothing or any kind of items that maybe a transient had left, because they thought both murders were committed by a transient. There would be no one in town who would do that, right? No one. Until a few days later, they come to arrest Joe Bryan. And mostly because of Mickey Blue Bryan's brother, Charlie Blue. Now, he lived in Plant City, Florida. The moment his parents, Otis and Vera, called and said Mickey's been murdered, he got on a plane and he flew out on Tuesday, just as soon as he found out about Mickey's death. They weren't really close. They just were very different in personality. Charlie Blue was more like Joe, very forceful and, outgoing, and Mickey was so quiet and polite. And it's not like Joe was, very close to his brother-in-law, Charlie, either. They hadn't really spoken much. It's October now. They hadn't really spoken since February, when he had come to visit them for a little while. They were cordial. Joe would help out Charlie in times when he needed help, because Charlie owned a farm in the Clifton area. They built fences together. They vaccinated cattle. It was like 2 guys who worked together, who were family, but they weren't like best buddies. But Charlie shows up and he asks Joe, "Can I borrow your car while I'm in town?" And Joe readily hands over the keys to his car. Here's my keys. You're my brother-in-law. Please take them, use them as long as you need. And Charlie Blue said that he called an ex-FBI agent who was a friend. His name is Bud Saunders. And Charlie Blue and Bud Saunders are driving in Joe's car. And he said that they were driving and had decided to pull over to relieve themselves. And Bud Saunders said that he got mud on his boots. And he was looking for something to clean that off before getting back into Joe's car. And Charlie opened up the trunk. And he sees a cardboard box with a flashlight inside. And he said that on the lens, which was face up, there was what appeared to him to be blood specks on the lens. And he hands the flashlight to his friend, Bud Saunders, and says, "Does that look like dried blood to you?" And Bud Saunders says, Yeah, it does. I think we should turn this over to the Texas Rangers." So they call the Texas Rangers and say, "This is what we have." And on this piece of information, the Texas Rangers arrest Joe Bryan. Charlie Blue doesn't even wait around. He gets on a plane and heads back home to Tampa. He, goes to Austin and gets a plane and heads back to Tampa. So Joe Willie, the Texas Ranger, is asking Joe Bryan, what is this? And Joe Bryan goes, oh, I don't even remember putting that into the trunk. But when the Texas Ranger Willie searches the trunk, he finds a bag of $850 that Joe Bryan says, oh yeah, I had gotten that out of the bank. We were going shopping in Waco, and Mickey didn't use the money, and I forgot it was there since the murder. I didn't even think about it. They also find a Chippendales calendar, which was supposed to be a gag gift for a friend. Now, this comes into play later also in the most terrible, awful way. They find the flashlight with the specks of what they said were human blood, and it was type O, and it was supposed to be Mickey's type, but not Joe's type. Now, blood typing was the most precise thing in 1985 they had as far as testing, and it's not really a definitive thing because I have type O. Apparently half of the population, close to half of the population has type O blood, and it was very small, specks. There's a crime lab chemist who said that there were tiny blue plastic particles on the flashlight, and she said it appeared to have characteristics as fragments of the birdshot shells. So there's your theory, producer Mark, that the birdshot is in shells.
In shells that you can put into a pistol. Interesting.
Yeah, I've never heard that, but I guess they were in shells. I thought you loaded it like an old-fashioned BB gun or something, but there you go, it's in shells. So she said that there's plastic fragments on the lens of the flashlight that is reminiscent of the birdshot shells. So on Wednesday, October 23rd, 8 days after Mickey is found dead, Texas Ranger Joe Willie shows up at Joe Bryan's mother's home, and they arrive unannounced, and Joe thinks they've come to tell him they found who killed his wife. And Texas Ranger Willie says, you're under arrest for the murder of your wife. And he says, are you serious? And as his mother is trying not to pass out behind him, he says, on what evidence? And they don't answer him, and they lead him away. And there was also a Waco news crew that is waiting there because they had been tipped off. So,
well, that's nice. That's nice when they do that.
Exactly. Joe Bryan was the kind of high school teacher that, like I said, he and Mickey believed in education so much that if someone's budget didn't allow for a class trip or a hot lunch or even school supplies, including clothing, they would cover those costs. They did it quietly and graciously and thought it was part of being an educator. And it's not, but as we know, teachers have to, cover the spread when things don't connect all the time. And these were teachers who had that mindset. When you ask any of his students, what did you think? They were like, he was tough, and it was tough love. One of his students, named Kelly Carpenter Daniels, was a senior at the high school when this terrible thing happened. And she said, I don't understand how this could happen. It's a terrible mistake. He was able to reach people in a way that few adults could. There's a deep bond there. It's like he was a great coach, and he was very beloved. And Kelly remembered something that happened a few years earlier where she and another classmate had cut school and driven to Lake Whitney. And it's, kind of a touristy attraction, but it's also a popular destination if you want to skip school. And she and her friend were playing in the water in the lake, and something caught her eye. And she looks up, and it's Joe Bryan standing above them in a suit on a rock with his hands on his hips, and he's frowning at them. And Kelly Daniels says, the disappointment on his face is something I will never forget. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't say, I'm going to call your parents. He told us to get out of the lake. He sat us down, and he told us we are leaders of the school, and leaders are supposed to lead.
Oh, my.
And the two girls thought to themselves, he made a 25-mile trip one way to ensure that I would get my ass back into class, and he would not allow me or my grades to slip. And she said he was an instinctively caring and compassionate person. I can't imagine him hurting anyone, much less murdering his wife. Now, pretty much every friend, colleague, co-worshiper at their church said the same thing. Even the superintendent, Richard Learden, said, I don't have any employees who think he's capable of anything that he's accused of. There's no motive, but he doesn't have the temperament to do something this terrible. He's slow to anger. He's the most calm, easygoing guy. This is a quote from John Paul Holmes, who's a special education teacher. He said, sometimes during the last period of the day, he would go into the choir room and just sit and quietly play the piano. I never saw him lose his temper. That was Joe. Everyone's saying the same thing. None of this makes sense. This is a marriage that, was harmonious, that everyone wanted to emulate in a relationship. This isn't where we think one day one is going to shoot the other. So Texas Ranger Willie, of course, is questioning every person who worked with Joe and Mickey. And he got more pushback when he interviewed Mickey's friends. So Susan Klein, who was an elementary school teacher, the one who sort of first discovered Mickey was not where she should have been in her room that morning. He asks Susan Klein, do you think Joe is effeminate? Do you think that there's rumors that he's gay?
Oh, for crying out loud.
And Susan Klein was like, what? What are you talking about? He loves his wife. They've been married for a long time. They're both deeply religious, and this is a very socially conservative town. We're talking about someone's life here? She said this to Ranger Willie. And yet, Ranger Willie won't let this go. He says, why was there a Chippendale's calendar in his trunk of his car? And they just won't let go.
I can't believe this.
No, it gets worse.
Oh my God.
It gets so worse. One investigator, when the notes were found about the questioning of their friends and family, he had written gay ? Feminine acting. He's a toucher. No one will admit that he made homosexual advances, but he would touch your arm or give you a hug readily.
Oh God.
He baked pies rather than fish or play poker.
I'm really gonna just jump out my window right now.
It gets worse. I mean, and we're talking about 1985 when things are there's a different way of speaking. One of the investigators had just written the word homo ?
Okay.
Yeah, I know. It's terrible. It's like, he drinks Dr. Pepper and plays the piano. Does that make him gay? I can't even imagine being indicted on a Chippendale's calendar in your trunk, which you say is a I have a deck of Chippendales playing cards I got on the one and only cruise I went on in 1990 because they're funny. But I also have pictures of, beautiful women, a Picasso reprint that was my mother's that when she passed away, I inherited. It's the blue nude. I have 2 beautiful paper cutting, Matisse paper cuttings that are framed there in our bedroom. It would be terrible if something happened to Mark and someone, investigated me and came into our home, because they would think I'm absolutely a complete and utter lesbian, if not bisexual, because I have pictures of women around.
No, they wouldn't, because this is a different time, and presumably the people here investigating my murder are not going to be homophobic assholes.
Well, there was a lot of that, and I really don't want this to be an indictment of law enforcement, except that it gets just so much worse.
It's not an indictment of law enforcement. It's an indictment of
specific individuals.
Where we where at least this particular part of Texas was in 1985. I don't think that I'm going to guess that you're right that things have changed now. But the fact that
I just wonder how much
that he was arrested based on this kind of flimsy nonsense and completely prejudiced.
It gets much more flimsy.
Yeah.
Admittedly, they will admit that it's flimsy. And he was not only indicted, he was convicted on no evidence, because the slim evidence that was presented has now been completely recanted. So he is brought up on these charges of killing his wife in March 1986, the state of Texas versus Joe Bryan. And it's by then he's lost everything. He was a Rotarian. He was, a Sunday school teacher. He was a high school principal. A generation of Clifton kids loved him. And by then he's lost a lot. The superintendent showed up at his home and said, "Would you consider resigning?" And Joe said, "No, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not." And he said, "Well, until this is all over, until the court has made a decision, we're going to have to let you go." So he had lost his job, his wife, his friends, his standing in society, his church friends. He'd lost it all. So I had no idea this was a possibility. Apparently every state is a little different, but in Texas, you can hire a special prosecutor even as a private family member. I assumed special prosecutors were brought in by, the DA or other legal teams, but Charlie Blue, Mickey's brother, hired and paid for all of the legal expenses for Gary Llewellyn, a bare-knuckled asshole who is a special prosecutor.
I didn't know that you could do that. I've
never
heard of that before.
Apparently, the laws differ from state to state, but they say it's, not uncommon for a DA that maybe is lacking all the resources to bring a case, something as challenging as this.
Sure. No, that I understand. Is the government can say, okay, we're going to hire a special prosecutor, but for a private citizen to hire one?
Yes.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah. Gary Llewellyn was not retained by the Bosque County DA, but rather Charlie Blue. Mickey's brother paid for him. And apparently a victim's family can hire a special prosecutor, but the DA still maintains control of the case. So there's a special prosecutor who's apparently a real kick-ass dude, and he's helping along with the DA from Bosque County. And they're really bringing up, forensic evidence that is not, very clear. Their case really just rests on the blood flecks on the flashlight found in his trunk. He said that he had usually kept it in his bedroom. He never denied it was his. He thought that it was still in his bedroom. He said that's the last place he remembered seeing it, and he doesn't really know what the relevance is to her murder. And they're trying to say that someone who shot her 4 times, 3 times in the head and once in the abdomen, was holding the flashlight while shooting. And the gun was never found, by the way.
Okay, so just to recap now, he admitted that he had a .357 that he had loaded with shells containing rabbit shot or whatever. Mm-hmm. Okay, but no gun was found.
No.
So somebody, if there was a gun in that bedroom, somebody took it.
Yes.
It was either Joe or somebody else who took the gun and took it away from the house.
Right.
If it was Joe, why would Joe admit to have had it? Why wouldn't he have just said, I don't have any guns?
Right.
Okay.
Right. So another piece of information you need to know about Joe is that he had an eye condition that prohibited him from driving at night in the dark. He was at his hotel. Unfortunately, it's 1985, and we don't have those sort of records and cameras that show when you exit or leave your hotel. But they did prove that he had called Mickey at 9 from telephone records and had gotten off at approximately 9:15. And what they think he did is get in his car, drive 120 miles during a torrential downpour in the dark to his home, kill his wife for zero motive other than a Chippendale's calendar, and turn around and drive back in the dark that he can't see in a torrential rain, end up back at his hotel in Austin, get ready in time to show up at 8 a.m. for his conference, where he at 10 a.m. is then told his wife is dead. So that's another piece of information that it would have been, could he have done it? Yes. Time-wise? Yes. Did he do it? I can't say for sure, but I'm really leaning toward no. I'm really...
2 words.
Really.
Reasonable doubt.
Yeah. It's all circumstantial, by the way. Everything. There's nothing, you can prove he was in the bedroom because he lived there. But some of the other information that should have been helpful turned out to be not handled correctly. There was an unidentified palm print on the headboard of the bed, which did not match Joe. It couldn't be determined if it was Mickey's because they had inked her palms at the time of her autopsy, and the tests were performed incorrectly, so they couldn't use that as a comparison for her.
For God's sake.
We know it's not Joe's. Could have been Mickey's, but again, handled incorrectly.
But that inures to the benefit of the defendant.
Yes, it does.
That's...
Yes, it does.
I'm telling you, I'm going to jump out the window.
Please don't jump out the window. Because the only thing I can say is that Joe has a faith that is keeping him going. And he has people who are trying to get what I think is probably a pretty big injustice overturned. You can't give him back the years of his life. I mean, I can't imagine anything worse than your beloved, your partner is gone, and you are convicted of their execution. And you then spend the best years of your life, what wouldn't have been very great without your partner, but maybe you had a chance to rebuild. You spend those years in the Walls prison unit in Texas, the prison with the highest amount of executions. It's not a great environment for anyone, but it's really not a great environment for someone like Joe Bryan. And the only thing that gives me hope is that there are people who are trying to right this wrong. So there was also a cigarette butt found on the bathroom floor. Neither of them smoked. There was a police officer named Kenneth Fields who said, I saw that cigarette butt fall off of Texas Ranger Willie's boot. and no one made note of it, but he said this later. People have tried to replicate that sort of thing happening, and no matter how many times they tried, the cigarette butt would fall off before they got to... I mean, you would have had to have picked it up and then it dropped. You couldn't walk around the house, get to the bathroom, and drop the cigarette butt. It just wouldn't stay more than a couple of seconds in any way, shape, or form in the tread of the boot, and they replicated it with Texas Ranger Willie's boot.
Let me just make sure I understand about the cigarette butt. There was a cigarette butt that was there, but the police are claiming, oh no, that was just a cigarette butt stuck inside the
Texas Ranger's boot.
The Texas Ranger's boot. It wasn't there on the scene.
Mm-hmm. Another police officer said, I saw it drop off of Texas Ranger Willie's boot.
Okay.
So during the trial, Charlie Blue is on the witness stand, and Joe's defense attorney is trying hard to show how fragile the state's case is against him. You know, he's asking, how would you prove to this jury, Mr. Blue, that you aren't the one that put the flashlight in the box in the trunk? And Charlie Blue says, I'm here to testify that I found it.
Okay. That's not an answer.
How can you tell us and prove positively that you didn't put the flashlight in the trunk? I didn't. I found it there. Okay. Do you have any motive as to why Joe Bryan would need to kill your sister? She's worth over $300,000 to him dead, if you want a motive. Well, it turns out that wasn't true. It was about half that. It was about $150,000, but you know.
Oh, well, life insurance.
Yes. So Mr. Blue had put in a claim saying that he should get the money. All of it. That was asked of Texas Ranger Willie when he was on the stand by Mr. McDonald, the defense attorney. Did you know that Mr. Blue filed a suit claiming he should get all of the money? And Texas Ranger Willie says, yeah, I know there's a suit that's filed. Defense attorney McDonald says, did you know that he was going to get all the money? Well, I don't know who was going to get the money, Ranger Willie says. And Mr. McDonald says, so you really haven't checked that out, have you? Right. So Special Prosecutor McMullen tells the jury, you know, finding a Chippendale's calendar is evidence of perverted behavior.
That's it. That's the whole thing. It was complete prejudice by the prosecution played on the prejudice of jurors.
Yes.
In a community where homophobia was still very, very prevalent.
Yes.
That's what convicted the guy.
Yes.
Just he's a fag.
Yep.
That's it.
They used the word homo and gay, but yes, I'm
that's what
sure
was going
privately
on. Yes,
they
right.
used the word fag. Yeah. So Robert Thorman is in the witness box on the final day of the state's case. And he said there had to be a vast amount of blood on whoever did this because there was so much blood spattering and because he'd taken his week-long training and knew everything about blood spatter except that he didn't. So Special Prosecutor McMullen said, focus on the flashlight. Focus on the flashlight. So Robert Thorman doesn't spend a lot of time describing all of his analysis of the bedroom because it really didn't go anywhere and didn't help anything. And there are pictures in the ProPublica article of the bedroom. It's all over walls. It looks like, and I'm not an expert, looks like backspatter where, someone has thrown back their arm and there are dots with dripping. It's everywhere. It's walls, ceiling, bed, pillows, chairs, lamp, pictures, curtains, plant. I mean, it's everywhere. Mr. Thorman says, backspatter usually travels no more than 46 inches. Now, Pamela Koloff, when she takes her workshop as a journalist, finds out that that's completely not true. That's not true at all.
It's just.
He did say, and a forensic pathologist who did her autopsy said, the greatest distance between Mickey and her killer was likely no more than a couple of feet. I don't know that that's true. And if it's only a couple of feet, why do you need to hold a flashlight? Mr. Thorman told the jurors that there's, not a lot of spatter on the flashlight's handle. That means someone was holding it when they shot her. The handle portion indicates that the flashlight was in the hand of the killer and was present at the time of the crime. It's not even close.
That's just completely making stuff up.
Yes. Special Prosecutor McMullen asked Mr. Thorman, so with all of this bloodstain patterned analysis, everything that's you've had to evaluate, there would have to have been shoes that would have fit the killer, right? So Special Prosecutor McMullen is obviously making an allusion to Joe Bryan having been the person there because his shoes would be there and he would change out of them. And of course, Robert Thorman, blood analyst expert, says, I would assume so. So it doesn't take very long at all before the jury comes back with a guilty verdict. And Joe hangs his head and says, I don't understand any of this, and I really haven't from the beginning. It's 4 hours later, and they find him guilty, and he is sentenced to 99 years. After the trial, he told Leon Smith, the editor of the Clifton Record, I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs, I did not kill Mickey. How anyone could think that I would do such a thing, I don't know. But he just stood there, just rendered mute, which of course makes all the sense in the world. But that February, Joe's conviction was overturned on a technicality. The ruling did not exonerate Joe, but it found fault with the trial. A 3-judge panel had concluded that the trial judge erred when he denied a particular defense request to reopen testimony late in the trial. In doing so, the judge prevented Joe's attorneys from reading to the jury a deposition they conducted with the Bryans insurance agent, in which the agent refuted the testimony from Charlie Blue that, Mickey was worth over $300,000 to Joe. Her life insurance was about half that much. So the ruling really didn't make a determination as to his guilt or innocence. He's still charged with murder, and the Boss County's DA's office would retry him in, the next year. But for the time being, he was free for a little bit while he's waiting to stand trial for the second time for a murder that he'd already been convicted of, that he said, he absolutely did not do. So at his retrial in June of 1989, things are definitely different in his life. He had 36 witnesses to back him up for the first trial. For the second trial, he has 5. There's not a lot of reporters covering it. People have left his life. They do end up using Special Prosecutor McMullen again to help the district attorney, because I guess they feel like he, was such a big help. And they used basically the same witnesses who were at the first trial. They used Robert Thorman. They spoke to Ranger Willie. Ranger Willie's like, oh, there's just blood everywhere. It's on the walls, the ceiling, the flashlight. Charlie Blue is in the witness box again, and he says, yeah, when I opened up the trunk, my eyes zoomed in on that flashlight. There's a crime lab chemist who says that the chemical properties of the shell casings are on the flashlight lens. And then they bring back Robert Thorman, and he ties all the loose ends together. And he says, based on my knowledge and experience and blood stain interpretation, the flashlight itself was right next to or near the source of energy, that being the gun. So now there's another guilty verdict that comes down pretty quickly, and Joe is again sentenced to 99 years in prison. He's sent back to the same prison he was previously held, the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas. And it's really ugly and uncomfortable. He gets letters from friends. He has a twin brother who has his twin brother Jerry, who has distanced himself. But he has an older brother who he's still in touch with and who writes him letters. His mother, of course. His mother died in 2001. He was unable to go to her funeral, and I think that was the thing that it seems like bothered him more than, anything else in this time that he has been in prison for a murder that, of his beloved wife. So in the following years, and after Pamela Koloff had taken her course on blood spatter analysis, she found out that Robert Thorman had never examined the flashlight. That was the big piece of evidence, and he based his findings on photos alone. And she took this course from a teacher who was, I think, open-minded and was trying to teach blood spatter analysis, but also said, if you don't understand the basic science, then you're not going to understand its limitations. He said, an isolated piece of evidence found in isolation is without context.
Precisely.
Its history is unknown. We don't know how the blood got on it, when it was placed in the trunk. It's just irresponsible to make that kind of classification. And Pamela Koloff was like, yes, I have found someone who understands. Her instructor said, it just takes a lot of imagination to come up with this. Now, Robert Thorman had declined to be interviewed for the article that Pamela Koloff did, but he did sign an affidavit years later saying, I feel like the information I had, was based on the information I had at the time, but it was not enough to convict Joe Bryan. Joe, while being in prison, has received, so many amazing letters of recommendation, even from the warden, who says he is an exemplary prisoner. He teaches other prisoners. He leads a Sunday school. He plays the piano in the chapel. He's a teacher, that's when he's interviewed. He said, the teacher in me is just always going to be there. So we had mentioned Judy Whitley, who had been murdered 4 months earlier in a different way, left in a field and strangled. And the Whitley family, maybe because the town is small, had wondered if the two murders were related. Dennis Dunlap is a police officer in several small towns around the area in Texas. He's moved from small police department to small police department. He went from one small town in law enforcement to the next. And he was a police officer in 1985 during the time of the Whitley murder. In fact, he may have been one of the people when they were searching for her who found her. He has a terrible history of erratic behavior that brought him under suspicion even in 1985. He was questioned and they had no evidence. And he told a friend that he was really glad that they hadn't checked his car because they would have found the duct tape that had been over Judy Whitley's mouth. Now, this is hearsay, but still, it's a pretty big indictment of Dennis Dunlap. He had a history of violence against women. One woman that he had choked after she had refused to have sex with him, he said, "I could kill you and you know it." He told several people that he had killed Judy Whitley. Dennis Dunlap died April 12th of 1996 when his girlfriend called 911 and said that my boyfriend is hanging in his garage. He had hung himself in his garage. They found letters that he had tucked away. Apparently, there must have been more information about what happened to Judy Whitley because they finally released, and they won't explain why, but the Clifton police say Dennis Dunlap killed Judy Whitley. The case is closed.
That's it?
That's it. Tell us why.
Yeah.
What is it that makes you find this case closed? What did he leave behind that tells you the case is closed? Judy Whitley's family has a strength that is unbelievable, and they believe that Dennis Dunlap also killed Mickey Bryan. And they are working hard on Joe Bryan's behalf. And they say, even if we can't get justice, at least we can fight on Joe Bryan's behalf and get his case overturned. And it's pretty interesting. In Mickey's case file, the number one theory as to why Joe Bryan killed his wife, queer. Yeah. Just the word queer.
Jeez.
Just the most, I mean, I don't even know what to say. So his job supervisor in prison told the parole board, "Joe is an exemplary model offender. Everyone echoes the same opinion as me. He does not belong here." That's what his job supervisor at the prison, at the Walls unit says. He does not belong here. And time after time, he is denied parole. Joe still gets up at 4 a.m. That's his time of getting up. He tutors inmates who are studying for the GED. He's allowed a 5-minute phone call to one family member once every 90 days. He has a subscription to the Clifton Record. He still gets the newspaper. He spreads it out and devours it, the football scores, all the little, tidbits of information about his hometown. And even John Grisham has based his newest novel on Joe Bryan's case. It came out in November of 2018, and it's called The Guardians. And I can tell you that I sent Mr. Bryan a card to the prison and said, it's a card, it's a picture of a sloth holding onto a tree. And I said, I hope you hang on as long as this sloth can hang on, and that there are people out here working on your behalf who want you to get the justice that you deserve, even if it's just another trial. But someone, somewhere, knows something. I know it. I know it. And I really hope if you do, you will notify the Texas Rangers or the Clifton Sheriff's Department, or the Bosque County Sheriff's Department, and help Joe Bryan get the justice he deserves. And more cowbell.
And the phone number for the Bosque County Sheriff's Office is 254-435-2362. And if you'd like to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/justthetipsters.